Imagine a child who can sit for, I don't know, 4 straight hours, meticulously building this insanely complicated 1,000-piece architectural Lego set.
Oh, yeah. Completely locked in.
Right. Just parsing hundreds of tiny, identically colored pieces with absolutely flawless concentration. But then the very next day in a classroom environment, that exact same child can't seem to focus for 2 minutes when a teacher calls their name.
It's a classic scenario.
It really is. And for decades, the field of psychiatry has slapped a very specific label on that classroom behavior, an attention deficit.
Right.
But what if their attention isn't broken at all? What if it's actually operating with a level of intensity that fundamentally breaks the definition of the disorder itself?
I mean, it is a question that completely upends how we view neurodevelopment. We are so accustomed to these standard labels that we really pause to ask if the label actually describes the biological machinery at work inside the brain.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are asking you to reconsider everything you might know about neurodivergence, attention, and just how we categorize human behavior in general.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
Yeah, our mission today is to unpack a truly startling statistic from the current psychiatric literature. If you are close to the neurodivergent community, or maybe, you've navigated these diagnostic waters firsthand, you might have actually encountered this.
You'll certainly have.
Right, because according to current medical literature, a massive 50% to 70% of individuals diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, also receive a comorbid diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD.
It is a staggering number. I mean, when you see a rate of dual diagnosis hitting 70%, it demands severe scientific scrutiny.
Oh, absolutely.
You really have to ask what you're actually looking at,
Yeah.
and whether the tools you were using to measure it are just, fundamentally flawed.
And to figure that out, we are grounding our discussion today in a deeply compelling 2022 peer-reviewed perspective article from Frontiers in Psychiatry.
Yes, great paper.
It's authored by researchers Camille Hours, Christopher Cossens, and Jean-Marc Balait. And the central mystery they pose to you and to the entire medical community is basically this 50 to 70% rate of dual diagnosis actually a neurobiological reality? Or are we, as a society and a scientific community, fundamentally misinterpreting the core symptoms of autism?
Because answering this requires us to look far beyond the surface behaviors. The things a parent or teacher might just casually check off on a survey.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are going to look beyond the surface, where do we start?
Well, we have to fundamentally deconstruct how modern psychiatry categorizes human attention, how it defines physical hyperactivity, and whether our diagnostic manuals are capturing reality or just, creating convenient illusions.
So before we can understand why these diagnoses are being tangled up together so frequently, we really need to establish how they are supposed to be clinically distinct.
Right.
If a doctor is looking at two different children, how do ADHD and ASD typically present in their classic forms?
Let's start with the standard clinical presentation of ADHD, at least as it's outlined in the literature. The timeline is actually really important here.
Okay, how so?
Well, ADHD is usually flagged a bit later in early childhood, often when school demands increase and things get harder.
Makes sense.
Clinicians are typically describing kids who struggle with sustained mental effort on tasks they find unrewarding. They are, highly distractible. They frequently lose their belongings.
Right, the classic signs.
But crucially, socially, they tend to be relatively boisterous, talkative, and they exhibit this really intense eagerness for peer interactions.
Because they want to engage.
They desperately want to engage, even if they struggle with the behavioral rules of that engagement because of poor impulse control.
Okay, so with ADHD, there is an outward-facing energy, an eagerness to connect, hampered by an inability to sustain focus on the boring stuff. But the classic presentation of ASD operates on a very different timeline, right? And a very different social profile.
Entirely different. I mean, children with ASD are typically identified much earlier, very often before the age of 3.
Wow, that early.
Yes. And instead of that boisterous eagerness, a child with ASD often presents as socially apprehensive. They show significant foundational difficulties in interacting and communicating in standard neurotypical ways.
And their physical signs too, right?
Exactly. You also see unique physical and verbal behaviors. Things like stereotypes, which are repetitive rhythmic movements, or echolalia, which is the repetition of words or phrases they've just heard.
The paper also heavily emphasizes an affinity for uniformity, Like, children with ASD often rely on highly routinized behaviors, doing the same thing in the exact same order to kind of keep the unpredictable nature of the world at bay.
Yes, the routine is paramount.
So, if we look at the semiology, the clinical signs, we have two vastly different profiles. One is an eager, outward moving child struggling to hold on to a thought. The other is a socially apprehensive child utilizing repetition and routine to manage a chaotic sensory environment.
Which is exactly why that 50 to 70% comorbidity statistic is so inherently suspicious.
Right. Because they sound nothing alike.
On paper, these are diametrically opposed operating systems in many ways. How are so many individuals perfectly satisfying the criteria for both?
And this is where Hours and her team start taking a sledgehammer to the data.
You really do.
They looked at the massive meta-analyses, the studies of studies basically that produce that 50 to 70% figure, and they found a glaring red flag in the underlying numbers.
Yes. When they actually dug into the individual studies that comprise those meta-analyses, they found that the comorbidity rates didn't just cluster neatly around an average of, say, 60%.
What did they find instead?
The rates reported by individual researchers ranged wildly, from as low as 10% all the way up to 90%.
Hold on, let me push back on that for a second. If I'm looking at a massive meta-analysis combining dozens of studies, isn't it completely normal to see a wide variance?
It's normal to see some variance, sure.
I mean, maybe one study used a terrible parent questionnaire and another used a strict clinical observation room. Or maybe one study only looked at severe cases and another looked at mild cases. Why do the authors jump straight from "this data is noisy" to "the foundational theory is a total myth"?
It is a fair question, and honestly, it is exactly the defense the standard scientific establishment uses. They call it methodological bias.
Methodological bias, okay.
They argue that the studies deviated because they used less valid measurement tools or different populations, just like you said.
Oh.
But Hours, Rakasins, and Ballate argue that a spread from 10% to 90% goes far beyond normal statistical noise.
It's too...
Think about it. If you are trying to measure the boiling point of water and different labs are getting results ranging from 10 degrees to 90 degrees, you don't just say, well, we have different thermometers.
Right. You have to assume they aren't all boiling water.
Exactly. You have to conclude that some labs aren't actually boiling water at all. They're boiling entirely different chemicals.
That makes so much sense. Like, if I look up a restaurant and the reviews are split perfectly between 1 star and 5 stars, ranging from 10% to 90% approval, I don't assume the reviewers have a slight methodological bias. I assume they are literally eating at different restaurants or grading completely different menus. Are researchers just grouping entirely different neurological phenomena under one umbrella?
This raises an important question regarding how our diagnostic manuals are structured. Because researchers are using a multitude of experimental paradigms, all believing they are measuring this single entity called ASD/ADHD comorbidity.
But it doesn't exist.
The results are scattered because the entity itself is a phantom. It doesn't exist in the way the diagnostic manuals suggest.
Which brings up a really important historical point about those manuals. Because for a long time, under the older DSM-4, you literally weren't allowed to diagnose someone with both autism and ADHD, right? They were mutually exclusive categories.
That is correct. Historically, psychiatry recognized that the severe attentional and behavioral traits of autism precluded a separate ADHD diagnosis. The autism essentially superseded it.
So what changed?
The DSM-5, which was released in 2013, fundamentally changed the rules. It explicitly allowed for a comorbid diagnosis.
Why did they do that?
Well, the intention was to capture complex clinical realities and allow kids to get access to more varied treatments, which is a noble goal. But the unintended consequence might be exactly what this paper points out.
That it gave them an easy out.
It gave clinicians permission to simply stack labels on a child without investigating the root cause of the behavior.
So if the underlying statistics justifying this dual labeling are a mirage, then we have to go back to basics. We have to look at the defining feature of ADHD, the so-called attention deficit, and ask how attention actually functions in an autistic brain.
That is the core of the issue.
Because if they don't have an attention deficit, the whole comorbid house of cards basically collapses.
To do that properly, we have to stop using the word attention like it's a single switch in the brain that flips on and off.
Right, it's not that simple.
We have to define it scientifically. Attention is a highly complex process of selection applied to the product of your perception. And to direct it, your working memory has to be trained on a specific goal.
So how do neuropsychologists break that down?
We break it down into several distinct executive functions.
Walk us through those components, because I think this is where the popular understanding really fails. People just think attention is attention.
Sure, so first you have sustained attention, which is basically vigilance, the ability to maintain focus over a long period.
Okay, sustained attention.
Then you have focused attention, which is the ability to zero in on specific stimuli. There's visual search, which is scanning your environment for a target.
Like looking for your keys.
Exactly. Then there is orienting, which is the physical and mental act of turning toward a new stimulus. There is disengagement, which is the ability to let go of what you're currently focusing on.
That sounds like a hard one.
It is. And finally, attentional filtering, which is your ability to ignore irrelevant background noise.
Wow. Okay, so when a parent says their kid can't pay attention, they could actually be talking about a breakdown in literally any one of those 6 distinct mechanisms.
Exactly. And this is where the paper delivers its most profound insight. When you put individuals with ASD through rigorous cognitive testing to measure these specific tools, they do not show a deficit in the way we traditionally understand it.
Wait, really?
In fact, people with ASD frequently demonstrate stronger, sustained, and focused attention than neurotypical subjects.
That is the aha moment right there. The very population we are diagnosing with an attention deficit disorder possesses a stronger capacity for sustained attention than the average person.
The researchers highlight a paradigm-shifting study by Mays and colleagues to prove this. They looked at selective attention, that ability to focus intensely on activities of high personal interest, like deep reading, coding, or assembling complex structures.
Like the Lego set from the intro.
Exactly like the Lego set. They found that this intense selective attention is present in 98% of children with ASD.
98%.
98%. And that held true regardless of the severity of their autism.
But wait, how does that compare to kids who genuinely have ADHD?
Yeah, it is the crucial comparison. Mays found that this same level of selective attention is present in only 21% of children with ADHD.
Wow.
So you have a 98% prevalence in ASD versus 21% in ADHD. The data is telling us unequivocally that we are looking at 2 vastly different neurocognitive systems.
So if their sustained attention is actually incredibly strong, why do they look like they have an attention deficit in a classroom or clinical setting?
The authors quote a clinical guideline that perfectly articulates the difference. It notes that attentional impairments in autism manifest as not listening and difficulty shifting focus.
Okay.
Conversely, ADHD is characterized by a short attention span
Yeah.
and excessive distractibility.
Okay, let's make sure this is crystal clear for you listening. If a child with ADHD isn't paying attention to the teacher, it's because their attention is like a flickering light bulb.
Good analogy.
It keeps shorting out, dropping the connection, and constantly needing to be switched back on. That's a short attention span.
Right.
But if a child with ASD is ignoring the teacher, it's not because their attention is broken and flickering. It's because their attention is like a high-powered industrial spotlight locked onto something else entirely, maybe the mechanics of a pen on their desk or the hum of the fluorescent lights. The light is blindingly strong. The problem is that the motor required to pan that spotlight over to the teacher is just slow to respond. We're calling a stuck spotlight a broken light bulb.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The impairment in ASD is primarily a deficit in disengaging. They struggle to orient their attention toward non-social stimuli, or they struggle with both reflexive and voluntary disengagement from their current point of hyperfocus.
They just can't turn the spotlight off.
Right. And we also have to highlight a major deficit in what developmental psychologists call joint attention.
Joint attention. Break down exactly what that looks like in early development, because I hear that term a lot.
Joint attention is the shared focus of 2 individuals on an object. It is usually achieved when one individual alerts another to an object by means of eye gazing, pointing, or other nonverbal indications.
Like a baby pointing at something.
Think of a toddler pointing at a dog and looking back at their mother to make sure she sees it too. It is the absolute foundational building block for social skills, language acquisition, and empathy.
And in ASD.
It is notably impaired or entirely lacking in the early development of children with ASD.
So, to an untrained observer or even a rushed clinician, frankly, a child failing to engage in joint attention looks like a child who is just distracted or inattentive.
Yes.
They look like they have ADHD, but the reality is they are paying intense attention. It's just not directed at the shared social target the adult wants them to look at.
Exactly. And to prove how robust this autistic attention can be under the right circumstances, the source material details a fascinating study by Barnard Brack.
What did they do?
They looked at rapid letter naming tasks, which are cognitive tests used to predict reading ability and measure processing speed. They compared the performance of children with ASD to children with ADHD.
And what did the data show?
The children with ASD actually spent significantly more time on the task and performed better than the children with ADHD.
So they beat them at the attention task.
They had the capacity for sustained productive focus that the ADHD group lacked. But Barnard Brack included a critical caveat that is vital for our understanding.
Which is,
The environment deeply impacts ASD performance on these cognitive tests. The setting dictates the outcome.
oh wow. So if you put that same autistic child in a room with buzzing fluorescent lights, loud traffic outside, and a scratchy chair, that high-powered spotlight of their attention might get locked onto the sensory discomfort.
Yes, absolutely.
They become physically incapable of disengaging from the sensory pain to focus on the letter naming task.
Yes. And a clinician watching that happen might write down highly distractible, unable to complete task, giving them an ADHD score, when in reality, the child is experiencing an overwhelming sensory bottleneck.
Which brings us to a massive contradiction.
It really does.
If the scientific data so clearly shows that the attention deficit in autism is actually a state of hyperfocus and a difficulty in disengaging, how did so many published peer-reviewed studies get it so wrong? How did entire branches of psychiatric literature conclude that ASD and ADHD were highly comorbid?
This is where Ours and her team take a very sharp scalpel to the existing literature. They specifically critique studies by researchers like Springer et al. And Green et al.
What were those studies claiming?
These were studies that looked at populations with dual diagnoses and concluded that autistic symptoms were far more severe in patients who also had ADHD.
Wait, how do they measure severity in that context?
Usually by counting symptoms on a standardized scale,
Mm-hmm.
Springer and Green argued that the presence of hyperactive and inattentive symptoms directly impacted and worsened the severity of the autism.
So they thought ADHD was making the autism worse.
They viewed the ADHD as an additive multiplier, exactly.
But the authors of our primary source argue that this logic is completely backward, right?
Completely backward. The authors synthesize a powerful counter-argument. These researchers have the causal arrow pointing in the wrong direction. It is illogical to assume that the presence of a second, entirely distinct disorder, ADHD, is swooping in and magically exacerbating the autism. Instead, we must recognize that severe autism inherently causes more pronounced attentional deficiencies and severe psychomotor agitation.
I want to make sure I grasp the mechanics of this. They are saying that if you have severe autism, profound difficulty in shifting your focus and intense physical restlessness are just built into the severity of your condition. It's part of the primary diagnosis.
Exactly. By labeling those severe attentional traits as a second disorder called ADHD, researchers like Springer and Green were essentially double counting the symptoms of autism.
Oh, wow.
They were inflating the severity scores with the phantom comorbidity.
So if it's not an ADHD deficit, what is the actual mechanism inside the autistic brain that causes this extreme hyperfocus and difficulty disengaging? The paper introduces a term for this that I found absolutely fascinating.
Yes, they introduced a concept developed by researcher Hochhauser and colleagues known as context blindness.
Context blindness. Let's unpack that for the listener, because understanding this mechanism really changes everything. How does context blindness actually work?
Well, in a neurotypical brain, when you enter a room, your brain rapidly processes the global picture, the context, and filters out the irrelevant local details.
You just get the gist of the room.
Right. But in ASD, the brain favors significantly greater processing of local details. It is a state of heightened hypergranular perception. The autistic brain is taking in an enormous unfiltered amount of highly specific sensory and perceptual data.
So it's not that their processing speed is slow, it's actually the opposite.
Precisely. Their processing speed isn't inherently impaired.
Yeah.
Rather, the intense, exhaustive way they process perceptual data creates a massive bottleneck for their attention.
Because there's just too much information.
They are processing so much localized detail, the texture of the carpet, the hum of the air conditioner, the exact tone of a voice, that they lack the cognitive bandwidth to instantly grasp the broader social or environmental context. hence context blindness.
I love that. Let's try an analogy here. If the neurotypical brain is a standard wide-angle camera taking a quick snapshot of a forest, the autistic brain is a massive, incredibly powerful 4K macro lens zoomed all the way in on the microscopic texture of a single leaf on a single tree.
That is a great visual.
It is capturing a breathtaking amount of data about that leaf,
Mm.
but because it is so hyper-focused and requires so much processing power to render that image, it doesn't realize that the rest of the forest is on fire.
Right.
The camera isn't broken, it doesn't have a deficit, it is just operating with a hyper-specific, highly demanding filter.
That is an exceptional way to visualize it. That heightened perception requires drastically more time and cognitive resources to process. It impacts attention directly and mechanically.
So it's not an attention deficit.
No. So again, it is scientifically inaccurate to slap an ADHD label on a child who is experiencing a sensory bottleneck.
Yeah.
It is far more accurate to understand these as attentional traits inherent to the unique processing style of ASD.
And for you listening, I want to pause and ask, why should you care about this distinction? Why does it matter if a doctor checks a box for ASD attentional trait versus a box for ADHD?
It matters immensely.
It matters profoundly because mislabeling the root cause of a behavior dictates how parents, teachers, and society treat that human being. You cannot treat context blindness by handing a kid an ADHD worksheet on time management.
Exactly.
You cannot treat a sensory processing bottleneck by telling a child to try harder to focus. If you don't understand the mechanism, your interventions are going to fail, and you're going to cause that individual a tremendous amount of frustration and shame.
Behavioral interventions must match the biological reality. And to truly settle this debate, to prove that this isn't just a philosophical argument about behavior, but a physical, biological reality, the researchers knew they had to look directly at the hardware.
The brain itself.
We have to look at the brain under the microscope through neurobiology and advanced neuroimaging.
Yes, the imaging data. This is where the theory becomes undeniable fact. If the behavior we're seeing isn't an ADHD attention deficit, then when we look at brain scans, we shouldn't see ADHD signatures, right? Let's map out the brain regions involved for both because they are fundamentally different neighborhoods.
They really are. ADHD is primarily fundamentally understood as a deficit in prefrontal inhibition.
Okay, the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, located right behind your forehead, is the executive manager of the brain. It regulates your impulses, it applies the brakes to stop you from blurting things out, and it helps you consciously ignore distractions.
So what's happening there in ADHD?
In an ADHD brain, that prefrontal braking system is underperforming. The connections are weak, or the neurotransmitter levels are insufficient to keep the brakes applied.
Okay, so ADHD is a prefrontal cortex issue. The brakes are worn out. What about ASD? Where does the imaging point for autism?
The neurofunctional map of ASD is much broader, much more complex, and resides in entirely different centers of the brain. Neuroimaging associates ASD with alterations in the orbitofrontal cortex, the superior temporal sulcus, the fusiform gyrus, the amygdala, and importantly, the cerebellum.
Hang on, I'm losing the thread a bit with all those anatomical terms. Walk me through what those actual structures do in a typical brain.
Let's break them down. The superior temporal sulcus is heavily involved in perceiving biological motion and interpreting social cues like where someone is looking.
Okay.
The fusiform gyrus is essentially the brain's facial recognition software. It helps you process and remember faces.
Got it.
The amygdala is the emotional processing center, acting as the alarm system for threats or highly salient information. And the cerebellum, located at the very back of the brain, is crucial.
What does the cerebellum do?
We used to think the cerebellum only controlled physical coordination and balance. But modern neuroscience reveals it plays a massive role in timing, prediction, learning processes, and complex executive functions.
That is a completely different neurological landscape. You're talking about sensory, emotional, and facial processing centers versus the prefrontal impulse control center of ADHD.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which raises the terrifying question. Isn't it incredibly risky, perhaps even negligent, to diagnose ADHD, a prefrontal cortex disorder, in a population whose primary neurological differences reside in the cerebellum, amygdala, and temporal regions?
To test that, the paper highlights a very specific fMRI study by Chanteloup and colleagues, and they use something called a temporal discounting task. Explain how that task works and what it measures.
A temporal discounting task measures how the brain processes delayed gratification and impulsive decision-making.
Like the marshmallow test for kids.
Sort of, but in a scanner. The subject is placed inside an fMRI scanner, which measures blood flow to different regions of the brain in real time, showing us which areas are working the hardest. While in the scanner, they are asked a series of questions like, would you rather have $10 right now or $50 in a month?
So it tests whether your prefrontal cortex can hit the brakes on your immediate desire for the $10 in order to secure the larger delayed reward.
Exactly. Chanteloup looked at 4 distinct groups of youth doing this task: a group with just ASD, a group with just ADHD, a comorbid group diagnosed with both ASD and ADHD, and a neurotypical control group.
If the current diagnostic manuals are right and comorbidity is real, then the comorbid group's brain scan should just look like an addition problem, right? The ASD scan plus the ADHD scan.
That would be the logical expectation if they were 2 separate co-occurring diseases. But that is absolutely not what the fMRI data showed.
What did it show?
The comorbid group didn't just show us some of the 2 disorders. The scans revealed that the comorbid group exhibited unique and significantly more severe impairments in the lateral and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the ventral striatum, and the anterior cingulate cortex.
So it's not A plus B equals AB, it's A plus B equals Z. It created a completely novel, neurofunctionally distinct profile that looks nothing like standard ADHD.
Precisely. The brain activation patterns prove that we cannot simply treat these individuals as having 2 separate, neatly co-occurring disorders. And this structural evidence is further backed up by electrical evidence.
The EEG data.
Yes. The researchers dive into EEG data, citing a comprehensive study by Lao Zhu et al., who looked at event-related potentials, or ERPs.
Okay, let's explain ERPs. I know an EEG involves placing a cap with all those little wet electrodes on the scalp to measure electrical brainwaves, but what makes it an event-related potential?
An event-related potential is when researchers measure the exact electrical spike in the brain that occurs precisely when a specific stimulus and event is presented to the subject.
Like a sound or a light.
Right, maybe a light flashes or a sound plays. By measuring the electrical wave in the milliseconds after the event, we can see exactly how the brain is processing that information before the person even consciously reacts.
So what does the electricity look like in an ADHD brain versus an ASD brain when an event happens?
In ADHD, the quantitative EEG profiles consistently show anomalies primarily in the theta and beta frequency bands. Think of these as the brain's idling and alertness gears.
Okay.
The anomalies reflect an underarousal. The brain struggles to detect the subtle clues needed to anticipate events. It's an impairment in performance monitoring and inhibitory control. The brain's electrical system literally struggles to generate the signal that says, pay attention, get ready to stop.
And the electrical profile for ASD?
It is functionally the opposite. The ASD electrical profile mainly relates to anomalies in the alpha, beta, and gamma frequency bands. These specific bandwidths are related to a state of hyperarousal.
Hyperarousal.
Yes. The anomalies reflect a heightened perceptual capacity, a longer retention of stimuli in the working memory, and highly atypical social and emotional processing.
So ADHD is characterized by electrical underarousal and impaired inhibition. ASD is characterized by electrical hyperarousal and an overprocessing of sensory data.
Exactly. The root biological causes of the attentional deficiencies in these 2 conditions are fundamentally, structurally, and electrically distinct.
This brings us to a massive, potentially dangerous real-world consequence.
It really does.
If ADHD is fundamentally a prefrontal cortex issue where the brakes are under-aroused and we treat it with amphetamine stimulants designed to wake up the prefrontal cortex, well, wait, let me use a dash there instead. If we use stimulants to wake up the prefrontal cortex, but ASD involves the amygdala, the cerebellum, and an electrical system that is already hyper-aroused and experiencing a sensory processing bottleneck.
You see where this is going?
Let me try a new analogy. If the ADHD brain is a car with a faulty braking system, amphetamines act like brake fluid to help the system engage, but the autistic brain isn't struggling with its brakes. The autistic brain is a car where the stereo is blasting at 150 decibels, blinding the driver with sensory overload. If you give that autistic driver ADHD amphetamines, you aren't fixing the stereo, you are essentially handing them a megaphone and turning up their internal arousal even higher. Right? You aren't targeting the actual system causing the stall.
That is a chillingly accurate analogy. And what's fascinating here is that the authors explicitly warn about this exact scenario.
They mention the medication.
They do. They state in the paper that amphetamine-based treatments can have paradoxical, highly undesirable, and sometimes severe adverse effects in the ASD population for this exact neurobiological reason.
Because you are chemically stimulating a system that is already overwhelmed.
Precisely. You are applying a chemical solution designed to stimulate the prefrontal cortex in a brain where the outward appearance of inattention is actually caused by a sensory processing bottleneck in the temporal and cerebellar networks.
It's just a mismatch.
A huge one. You risk pushing an already heightened perceptual system into a state of severe distress.
That is terrifying, honestly. The idea that a misapplied label on a piece of paperwork could directly lead to a medication regimen that makes a child's underlying sensory overload so much worse.
It highlights the absolute vital importance of getting the underlying etiology, the root biological cause, correct. We cannot afford to diagnose based solely on surface behaviors.
Okay, so we've established that the attention deficit in ASD isn't ADHD, but we have to tackle the other half of the acronym, the hyperactivity.
Yes.
What about the intense physical hyperactivity, the constant movement, the pacing, the hand flapping, the inability to sit still in a chair that so many autistic individuals display? If that's not ADHD, why are they so physically agitated?
To understand that, the authors rigorously examine the origin of psychomotor agitation in ASD. They refer back to findings by Mays et al., who conducted deep behavioral profiles.
What did Mays find there?
Mays demonstrated that a condition called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, or DMDD, is extremely prevalent among children with ASD. In fact, it is significantly more prevalent in the ASD population than in neurotypical children or children with just ADHD.
Disruptive mood dysregulation. That sounds like a profound emotional intensity.
It is. It involves severe, recurrent temper outbursts that are grossly out of proportion in intensity or duration to the situation. Furthermore, the researchers noted that 91% of the autistic children presenting with those severe dysregulation symptoms also satisfy the clinical criteria for oppositional defiant disorder.
91%. That is almost universal in that specific cohort.
Yes. What this data reveals is a very high prevalence of externalizing agitated behaviors in ASD that are driven primarily by mood, frustration, and emotional regulation failures.
Not just a lack of motor inhibition.
Exactly, not like in ADHD. The presence of psychomotor agitation in an autistic child cannot be automatically attributed to ADHD hyperactivity. The data strongly suggests it is an emotional dysregulation disorder, more directly linked to the behavioral effects of severe irritability and sensory distress.
And this brings us right back to the amygdala, doesn't it? The emotional alarm system of the brain. The paper cites research by a scientist named Vu Mie on something called emotional attention. How does that connect?
This is a crucial bridging concept. Emotional attention refers to the neural mechanisms where your sensory processing and your attention are actually modulated and directed by the affective or emotional impact of a stimulus.
Okay, so the emotion drives the attention.
Right. Vumier's research shows that the amygdala plays a central commanding role in producing top-down signals. The amygdala essentially reaches out to the visual and sensory cortexes and shapes how emotional events are represented and prioritized in the brain.
Let me see if I have this right. Agitation in ADHD is a simple lack of physical inhibition. The motor cortex wants to move, and the prefrontal cortex fails to stop it.
Correct.
But agitation in ASD is often a state of intense physical restlessness linked directly to emotional or sensory dysregulation. The amygdala is screaming that the environment is overwhelming, the brain is being bombarded by unregulated signals, and the body moves, paces, or acts out to cope with that massive internal storm.
Precisely. Or in some cases, the agitation can be an expression of underlying cerebellar dysfunction, given the cerebellum's role in regulating complex movement and cognition.
Either way, it's a completely different mechanism than ADHD hyperactivity.
It is, and this is further illuminated by the findings of Liss and colleagues.
What did Liss find?
Liss demonstrated that sensory overreactivity in ASD, how intensely a person reacts to sound, light, or touch, is directly statistically linked to overfocused attention, to perseveration, which is getting stuck on a thought or action, and to stereotyped physical behaviors.
So sensory seeking or sensory avoidant behaviors.
Exactly. And here is the trap for the clinician. Sensory seeking behaviors can look remarkably like ADHD inattention or hyperactivity to an untrained observer.
Because they're moving around a lot.
Yes. An autistic child might be moving constantly, bouncing their leg or pacing in order to generate proprioceptive input physical feedback from their muscles and joints, which actually acts to soothe their nervous system.
Oh, wow.
Or they might be looking all over the room, highly distractible, because the fluorescent lights are humming at a frequency that is physically painful to them, and they are desperately scanning for a way out.
It looks like ADHD distractibility, but it is fundamentally a coping mechanism for a difference in sensory processing.
Right. And there's a deep chemical layer to this physical agitation, too, which the paper dives into. They discuss the dopaminergic hypothesis.
Yes, the dopamine pathways.
Mhm.
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays multiple roles depending on which pathway it is traveling along in the brain. In ASD, there is a hypothesis gaining significant clinical support that there is dopaminergic hyperactivity along two very specific pathways. Okay, let's map those out. What are the two pathways?
First, the nigrostriatal pathway. This pathway travels from the substantia nigra to the striatum, and it is heavily involved in the production and regulation of movement.
So that relates to the physical stuff.
Right. Hyperactivity in this pathway would explain the stereotypes, the repetitive motor movements, the hand flapping, the rocking.
And the second pathway?
Second, there is the mesolimbic pathway, which travels from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. This is the brain's primary reward and emotional salience pathway. Hyperactivity here would explain the profound interpersonal deficits, the intense emotional reactivity, and the altered reward processing we see in autism.
So we have dopamine hyperactivity causing the physical agitation and the emotional intensity. What does that mean for how we treat it medically?
It explains a clinical observation that has confused people for a long time. Why dopamine antagonists, medications like risperidone or aripiprazole that actually block dopamine receptors, are sometimes perceived as highly effective for managing severe agitated ASD symptoms.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. ADHD is typically treated with dopamine agonists like amphetamines, which are designed to increase the amount of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex to help it function.
But if you use that for ASD,
If you take a brain that is already suffering from dopaminergic hyperactivity in the nigrostriatal and mesolimbic pathways, and you introduce an agonist that creates even more dopamine activity, you can see exactly how that would cause the paradoxical, highly undesirable effects the authors warned about earlier.
you are throwing gasoline on a fire. So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? It means that when you see an autistic individual who is agitated, pacing, or seemingly unable to sit still, you cannot assume they are hyperactive in an ADHD sense.
Yeah, you can't.
They might be overwhelmed by an incredibly loud internal or external sensory environment. Their dopamine pathways might be hyperactive. Their agitation is a communication of profound overload and distress, not a simple deficit of behavioral inhibition.
Which is why interventions need to be sensory-based, environmentally accommodating, and neurologically appropriate, rather than purely behavioral or stimulant-based.
We have covered a massive amount of ground so far. We've deconstructed the behavioral checklists. We've looked at the neurobiological imaging, the fMRI scans, the EEG electrical data, and the dopamine pathways. Now, we must look at the real-world implications. The so what?
Right, the practical application.
What does this mean for how we diagnose, how we test executive function, and ultimately how we understand neurodivergence? To answer the so what, let's look at how executive function is actually tested in a lab, because this is often the battleground where these diagnostic labels are fought over. The authors review a deeply revealing study by Carter Leno et al. On executive function, specifically looking at go-no-go tasks and switch tasks in adolescents. Let's explain those methodologies so we know exactly what is being measured. A go-no-go task is basically testing impulse control, right? Like a video game where you have to press a button as fast as you can when you see a green car, but you have to completely withhold pressing the button when a red truck appears.
Precisely. It is a pure test of response inhibition, how quickly your brain can hit the brakes on a planned action. Carter Leno ran these tests and compared 4 groups, typically developing youth with just ADHD, youth with oppositional defiant disorder, and youth with ASD.
And what happened when they crunched the numbers?
Initially, they found deficits in response inhibition shared across all the non-typical groups. But here's the crucial, brilliant part of their methodology. They ran a statistical analysis that controlled for the symptoms of ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder within the ASD group.
Wait, explain what controlling for symptoms means in this context.
It means they used statistical modeling to mathematically remove the influence of any ADHD-like symptoms from the data of the autistic kids. They essentially asked the data, if we factor out the kids who seem highly distractible or hyperactive, how do the core autistic traits affect the test?
And what happened?
The results were stunning. After controlling for those symptoms, the ASD group alone exhibited specifically impaired response inhibition and premature responsiveness relative to the typical group.
Let me make sure I'm hearing this correctly. Even when you mathematically strip away the ADHD symptoms from the equation, the autistic kids still showed profound impairments in impulse control and response inhibition on the go-no-go task.
Yes, unambiguously.
Yeah.
This proves that executive functioning impairments that psychiatry typically associates specifically and exclusively with ADHD, like difficulty hitting the brakes on a response, are actually just inherent foundational parts of the ASD neurology as well.
Hmm.
You do not need a comorbid ADHD diagnosis to explain them. They belong completely to the autism.
It's built into the operating system from the ground up.
Exactly.
And that operating system develops differently from day one, largely because of a concept we touched on earlier, joint attention. How does a lack of joint attention in infancy physically alter the brain's development?
The authors rely on the developmental research of Mundy et al. To explain this cascade. We often think of joint attention as just a neat social trick a baby learns, pointing at a toy so mom looks at it. But Mundy's work shows it is far more than that. Joint attention plays a key role in the physical, functional development of a widely distributed cortical system.
It's the scaffolding for the brain.
Exactly. It forces the integration of both anterior networks, like the prefrontal and insular cortices, which handle executive function and self-awareness, and posterior networks, like the temporal and parietal cortices, which handle sensory and spatial processing.
So because autistic children structurally struggle with joint attention in their very first years of life, it literally alters the entire functional development of how their brain connects and processes information globally.
Yes. Early impairment in joint attention has direct, lifelong repercussions on how the brain integrates internal executive commands with external sensory data. It alters cortical processing on a global scale.
So it's not a localized issue.
No. The attention differences in ASD aren't a localized glitch. They're the result of a completely different developmental trajectory of the whole brain network.
And we can see physical, anatomical evidence of this trajectory. The text mentions a structural MRI study by Harris et al.
Yeah.
That really drives this home.
Yes, Harris and his team looked at structural MRI scans of children with ASD and compared them to how those children performed on visual orienting tasks, how fast they could shift their gaze to a new stimulus. They found that a delay in orienting attention directly and mathematically correlated with the severity of cerebellar hypoplasia.
Hypoplasia meaning underdevelopment of the tissue.
Exactly, underdevelopment of the cerebellum. The slower the child was to orient their attention, the more pronounced the physical difference in their cerebellum was on the MRI. And notably, they found absolutely zero correlation with the sizes of other brain regions, like the prefrontal cortex. The cerebellum, which we know is altered in early ASD development, is deeply and specifically implicated in their attentional differences.
So we have clinical observation data, cognitive go-no-go task data, developmental joint attention data, and structural MRI data, all pointing independently to the exact same conclusion.
Which leads the authors, Auers, Rakasins, and Bellite, to their ultimate controversial synthesis. Comorbidity is the wrong word entirely. The staggeringly high rates of dual diagnosis, that 50 to 70% statistic we started with, are not describing two distinct diseases co-occurring by chance.
Right.
They're describing the severe end of an attentional trait that is present biologically and structurally in all individuals with ASD.
The intense hyperfocus, the sensory bottlenecks, the context blindness, the difficulty disengaging, the physical restlessness born from sensory overload, these are not ADHD. These are inherent defining features of autism. They belong squarely in the diagnostic definition of ASD itself.
Exactly. And in making this argument, the authors are leveling a profound and necessary critique against the polythetic nature of modern psychiatric diagnoses.
Let's make sure that's clear for the listener. Polythetic means diagnosing by checking boxes off a symptom list, right? Like the DSM-5. If you have 5 out of 9 symptoms on page 42, you get the label, regardless of the biological mechanism causing those 5 symptoms.
Precisely. It is symptom matching without any regard for the underlying neural mechanisms. The authors argue powerfully that attention deficits and executive dysfunctions are key behavioral phenotypes, outward symptoms of many complex neurological, developmental, and genetic diseases.
So we can't just group them all together?
Slapping an ADHD label on all of them just because a child is distracted is an erroneous, scientifically lazy generalization. It completely ignores the neurobiological facts. We urgently need better clinical imaging and electrophysiological tools to fractionate and deeply analyze these unique neuropsychological traits rather than relying on blunt polythetic checklists.
For you listening, this connection is so vital. It's easy to see why the system relies on convenient labels. Slapping an ADHD diagnosis onto an ASD patient because they both share the word distractibility on a survey might make the clinician's paperwork easier.
Oh, absolutely. It's an administrative shortcut.
Right. It might get an individualized education program approved faster in a rigid school system that demands neat, easily understandable boxes to allocate funding. But that bureaucratic convenience comes at a massive cost. It obscures the unique, beautiful, and complex biological reality of the autistic brain. And ultimately, it prevents true understanding and proper, humane support.
I couldn't agree more. If we do not define the neurodivergence accurately, we cannot support the individual effectively. We risk using the wrong medications, applying harmful behavioral interventions, and fundamentally misunderstanding the child's lived experience. The science demands that we do better.
We have covered a monumental amount of ground in this deep dive. We started by questioning a 70% comorbidity statistic that seemed too high to be true.
And we found out why.
Yeah. We deconstructed attention, realizing that the classic ADHD attention deficit is entirely different from the autistic experience of profound hyperfocus, context blindness, and difficulty disengaging. We looked at the neurobiology and saw that we are dealing with the cerebellum, the amygdala, and hyperaroused electrical systems in ASD compared to the underaroused prefrontal cortex in ADHD.
Very different machinery.
And we've arrived at the realization that ASD requires a richer, infinitely more accurate diagnostic definition, not a secondary ADHD label pasted clumsily on top of it.
It serves as a perfect example of why rigorous critical thinking in medicine is so essential. We must always, constantly, relentlessly question whether the categories and boxes we've created in our manuals actually reflect the biology and the reality of the human beings we are trying to help, or if they are just convenient illusions we've agreed to believe in.
Absolutely. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. Throughout the source material, there were brief but incredibly vital notes about how deeply the environment influences an autistic individual's performance on these attention tasks. Like the Barnard-Brack study, where the setting dictated the outcome.
Yes, the environment is everything.
If the physical environment entirely dictates how well someone with ASD performs on a cognitive test, it makes you wonder. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. It makes you wonder, what if the so-called disorder of attention in autism is, in many ways, just a severe, tragic mismatch between a highly specialized, hyperperceptive sensory system and the rigid, artificially distracting, fluorescent-lit environments of our modern classrooms and open-plan offices?
That's a huge perspective shift.
If we change the world to fit the profound capabilities of the brain, rather than pathologizing and diagnosing the brain for not fitting the world, would we even need these labels at all?
That is a profound and necessary question to end on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dose. See you next time.